In the grand halls of Madrid, marble statues still whisper of forgotten kings. Among them stands a shadow darker than any other. His name was Ferdinand, remembered not for valor or wisdom, but for the sickness that consumed both his body and his kingdom. When historians speak of Spain's fall from glory, they often point to wars, revolutions, or the greed of empire. Yet behind those headlines lies a more intimate rot, a secret that began not in a throne room, but in a bedroom. Ferdinand was born into a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines and purity. Every move, every breath was meant to preserve royal perfection. But what happens when the very symbol of divine authority is flawed? When the king's own flesh becomes a curse? This is not just a story of lust and cruelty. It is a story about power itself, how shame can turn into domination, and how the body of one man became the metaphor for a dying monarchy. Tonight, we return to the Spain of the early 19th century, where a deformed prince, haunted by humiliation, would grow into a king whose desires scarred a nation. Before he became a monster in the eyes of history, Ferdinand was simply a boy trapped inside a royal cage. Born into the Bourbon dynasty, he was raised under the unrelenting gaze of priests, courtiers, and doctors. From his first days, whispers followed him, rumors about his strange body, his awkward gait, and the shame his parents tried to conceal behind layers of silk and ceremony. Spain, still licking its wounds from the Napoleonic Wars, needed an heir who embodied strength and virility. Instead, it got a prince whose most private deformity made him the target of ridicule across Europe. Medical records from the time describe his condition as macrogenitosomia, a grotesque enlargement that made him both feared and pitied. For the court physicians, it was a curiosity. For Ferdinand, it was a lifelong humiliation. His first marriage in 1802 to his cousin Maria Antonia of Naples was meant to unite two powerful families and secure the Bourbon legacy. Yet what happened behind the bridal doors would echo for decades. The young couple failed to consummate their marriage for nearly a year. Each night ended the same way, with confusion, frustration, and tears. Letters from Maria Antonia's mother reveal the desperation inside the royal chambers. "My daughter weeps every night," she wrote. "The prince feels nothing. He does not understand what is required of him." Ferdinand's tutors, priest, and even a confessor tried to intervene, explaining the mechanics of intimacy to a man who could not reconcile faith with flesh. He was a prince educated in scripture, not in human desire. What should have been a private struggle became public shame. Across the courts of Europe, ambassadors mocked the impotent Spaniard, a man unfit to father heirs or rule an empire. That ridicule left scars deeper than any physical wound. Within Ferdinand grew a hunger not for love but for control. His anatomy became a weapon he could neither use nor escape. The young man who once prayed for normalcy began to equate manhood with domination. To him, pleasure and humiliation were two sides of the same crown. When Maria Antonia died at just 21, likely from injuries caused by their attempts at consummation, the final shred of innocence in Ferdinand's soul disappeared. From that point on, his deformity was no longer a curse to hide. It became his justification, his secret claim to uniqueness, and ultimately, the dark core of his rule. By the time he ascended the throne, Ferdinand had learned the cruelest lesson power could teach, that what you cannot control in yourself, you can destroy in others. And he was about to destroy far more than any man before him. When Ferdinand reclaimed the throne of Spain in 1814, after Napoleon's defeat, the nation expected restoration and stability. What it received instead was a decade of fear, repression, and moral collapse. The same man who once trembled with shame now ruled with the arrogance of a god. He immediately abolished the liberal constitution that promised freedom to the people. The prisons of Madrid filled with reformers and soldiers who had fought for liberty. Executions became public spectacles, and Ferdinand watched them with the same detached curiosity he once reserved for medical examinations of his own body. Spain's spirit was crushed under the weight of one man's insecurity. But as the kingdom rotted politically, Ferdinand's private life descended even deeper into darkness. Almost every night, under a heavy cloak, the king left the royal palace to wander through the filthiest quarters of Madrid. His destination was a brothel run by the infamous Pepa Lalaga, a woman who catered to the most secret desires of the city's elite. To ordinary citizens, that place was a pit of sin. To Ferdinand, it was his true court. There, surrounded by a circle of young nobles as corrupt as himself, the king turned debauchery into ritual. Drunk on cheap wine, He flaunted the same deformity that had once humiliated him, boasting of his unnatural size as if it were proof of divine favor. Witnesses would later describe grotesque scenes, Ferdinand challenging his companions to compare themselves, crowning himself El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. But this was more than indulgence. It was performance, a king trying to prove his manhood to the world by destroying others. Peppa's girls, many still in their teens, were not partners but offerings. Ferdinand kept bloodstained rags as trophies, each marked with a name and date, a twisted archive of conquest. These were not the acts of lust, but of a man asserting power in its most primitive form. Outside the palace walls, Spain was falling apart. The empire lost its colonies in the Americas. The economy collapsed. Farmers starved while Ferdinand built a private museum of human suffering. The connection was no accident. Historians later noticed that his collections grew after every political crackdown. After signing death warrants, he would seek new victims in the brothels. Violence in the courtroom mirrored violence in the bedroom. To Ferdinand, domination was a cure for shame. Each act of cruelty was a way to silence the laughter that once echoed in foreign courts. But by trying to assert control over his flesh, he instead surrendered to it. The King of Spain, who should have been the embodiment of divine authority, had become the slave of his own perversion. By the end of the decade, his corruption had reached every corner of the empire. Ministers feared him, nobles mocked him behind closed doors, and the people prayed for deliverance. Yet no one could imagine that the same body that caused so much humiliation and death would soon give birth quite literally to the next disaster of Spain's monarchy. The Palace of Madrid had become a theater of suffering, and its leading roles were always played by women. For Ferdinand, marriage was not companionship, it was experimentation. Each queen became another attempt to repair what nature and shame had broken. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, entered the royal court in 1816, a woman of grace and quiet intelligence. While Ferdinand lost himself in brothels, she sought purpose in art and education, founding the Prado Museum and opening academies for women. But when she became pregnant in 1818, the hope of renewal quickly turned to horror. The child was breech, the queen in agony. The doctors begged the king to choose between mother and child. Ferdinand, driven by obsession with an heir, gave a single order: save the child. Without anesthesia, in a time when surgery was closer to torture, Maria Isabel was cut open. She was conscious when the scalpel tore her flesh, screaming as the child, already lifeless, was lifted from her womb. She died moments later, her blood soaking the same marble floors where Ferdinand had once held feasts. That night, the King of Spain drank alone. But grief did not humble him. It only deepened his conviction that the royal body, his body, must prevail at any cost. His next bride was Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, barely 16, a convent-raised girl who believed children were delivered by angels. Their wedding night became one of the most humiliating events in European royal history. Terrified by the sight of her husband, the young queen fled in panic. For weeks, she resisted him, praying every night for God's protection. Ferdinand, desperate to assert his authority even in the bedroom, appealed to the Pope himself. The Holy Father sent a letter urging Maria Josefa to fulfill her sacred marital duty. Yet even divine command could not erase her fear. She agreed to submit only after reciting a full rosary and keeping her eyes closed through the act. For 10 long years, the royal marriage continued under these conditions: silent, prayerful, lifeless. No children were ever born. By the time Maria Josefa died in 1829, Ferdinand was 45 and childless. Spain faced a future without an heir, and the dynasty stood on the brink of extinction. That was when he met Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, his own niece, a woman both cunning and practical. She understood what her predecessors never could, that survival in this court required more strategy than sentiment. Maria Cristina approached her husband's deformity not with horror but calculation. With the help of the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez, she devised an extraordinary solution: a silk cushion with a shallow opening precisely measured to control depth during intercourse. It was, in essence, a medical device built to preserve the monarchy. Ferdinand accepted the idea, convinced it would secure the future of his line. It worked. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to Isabella and 2 years later to Luisa Fernanda. For the first time in decades, joy returned to the Spanish court. Cannons roared, bells rang, and Ferdinand proclaimed divine favor had restored his house. But beneath that celebration lay the ultimate irony. The future of Spain depended on a piece of silk with a hole in it. To ensure his daughter's succession, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, overturning the ancient law that barred women from the throne. His brother Don Carlos, enraged by the decree, swore rebellion. When Ferdinand died 3 years later, the war he had unknowingly engineered through his obsession began the Carlist War, a brutal conflict that drowned Spain in blood. Thus, the story of a malformed body became the story of a fractured nation. The king who could not control his flesh had turned his entire kingdom into a reflection of it, a realm bleeding from wounds of pride, shame, and unnatural ambition. When Ferdinand died on the 29th of September 1833, the bells of Madrid tolled not in mourning, but in weary relief. The man who had ruled through fear and humiliation left behind no peace, only ruin. His brother raised a banner of rebellion, his widow remarried a palace guard, and his infant daughter inherited a throne already stained with blood. Yet the true legacy of Ferdinand was not political, it was anatomical. His rule revealed something unsettling about monarchy itself. Beneath all the jewels, rituals, and divine titles, royal power remained tied to the body. The strength of a kingdom depended not on wisdom or virtue, but on a man's ability to reproduce. When that body failed, the entire illusion of divine order collapsed. After his death, Maria Cristina ordered servants to search the royal chambers. Hidden in a cedar chest, they found what courtiers had only whispered about: dozens of blood-stained cloths, each labeled with a woman's name and date. A private archive of suffering, meticulously catalogued by the hand of a king. Some of those women had been peasants, others maids, others daughters of men he had executed. The dates revealed a terrible pattern. Whenever Ferdinand signed death warrants, new trophies appeared. His cruelty in the council hall was mirrored by violence in the bedchamber. Maria Cristina burned the collection, hoping to erase its memory. But ashes do not forget. They remain in history's breath. The royal secret she tried to destroy became legend, a symbol of how unchecked power can turn human pain into ceremony. In the decades that followed, Spain paid the price. The Carlist Wars ravaged the land. Isabella II, the daughter born from the engineered union, would inherit not just a crown but her father's moral decay. Her own scandals and affairs would one day topple the dynasty he fought so grotesquely to preserve. And so, Ferdinand's story ends as it began with a body that ruled and ruined. His deformity was not only physical, it was political, spiritual, and national. He mistook domination for redemption, cruelty for strength, and desire for destiny. In doing so, he transformed his flesh into the perfect metaphor for the monarchy itself, glorious on the outside, diseased within. History remembers him by many names: the Felon King, the Monster of Madrid, the Predator with the Crown. But perhaps his most fitting title is the one he could never claim simply: a man. For in trying to prove his manhood to the world, Ferdinand lost the very thing that makes us human, and that is the true anatomy of power. When a throne is built on shame, it can rule for a time, but it can never endure. The body dies, the bloodline fades. Only the corruption remains, echoing through centuries as a warning. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters in history do not hide in darkness. They sit on thrones, crowned by the silence of those too afraid to speak.